They don't put it in the marriage advertisements, the part about how a man's eyes can look right through you like your livestock at auction. Martha had read the notice 3 times before, answering it desperate enough to cross half a continent for a stranger's name and a roof that wasn't her sister's charity. Silas Vane gave her the roof. He gave her the disdain for free. But on the first night, crouched beneath rotting floorboards while boots walked over her head, and a woman died 6 inches from her face. Martha received something no one had ever given her before, a reason to survive that had nothing to do with pleasing anyone. The man who would eventually save her life was 3 miles away, sharpening a knife and planning to use her as bait. Neither of them knew yet that they were each other's last chance. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Harrow Creek General Store like a wounded animal finally giving up the ghost, and Martha Connolly stepped down into the Texas dust with the particular stillness of a woman who has already decided she will not cry. Not here, not in front of strangers. She had done her crying 3 weeks ago in a boarding house in Philadelphia, sitting on a narrow bed with the advertisement folded in her lap, reading it until the words blurred. Seeking a capable woman of sound character for frontier partnership in marriage. Passage provided. Respond to Box 7, Harrow Creek, Texas. She had written back the same night. Desperate people rarely hesitate. She was not what anyone would call beautiful, and she had long since stopped pretending otherwise. She was broad through the shoulders, heavy through the hips, with large, capable hands that had spent 20 years cooking and mending for a family that barely acknowledged she existed. Her sister had called her the reliable one, which was the cruelest kindness Martha had ever received. She had taken the advertisement and the ticket it promised and told herself it was courage. Standing now in the white glare of a Texas noon, her carpet bag in one hand and a borrowed hat shading her face, she told herself the same thing again and almost believed it. Silas Vane was waiting on the porch of the feed store across the street. She recognized him immediately, not because she had any description of him, but because a man like Silas Vane made himself impossible to miss. He was lean and impeccably dressed in a black coat that had no business surviving the frontier dust this clean, with a silver watch chain catching the light at his vest pocket. He was handsome in the way that certain dangerous things are handsome, the way a drawn blade is handsome, all clean lines and cold purpose. He was watching her the way a man watches a piece of furniture being delivered, measuring whether it will fit already, deciding it probably will not. He crossed the street without hurrying. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her for a long moment, and Martha held very still under that gaze, the way small animals hold still when a hawk passes overhead. "You're larger than I expected," he said. His voice was pleasant. That was somehow worse. "Your advertisement didn't specify dimensions," Martha said, and was surprised to hear her own voice come out level. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not respect. Not quite. But he had registered that she was not going to collapse on the spot, and he filed that information away with the practiced efficiency of a man who collected useful things. He picked up her carpet bag without asking and turned back toward the feed store, clearly expecting her to follow. She followed. She had not come 2,000 miles to stand in the street. The wagon he led her to was driven by a man named Cord, a thick, silent creature with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, who never once looked directly at Martha in the 3 hours they rode out to Silas's property. Silas sat beside her in the wagon bed for the first hour and said almost nothing. He asked if she could cook. She said yes. He asked if she could keep accounts. She said yes. He asked if she had any family who would come looking for her. The pause before she answered was barely a breath long. "No," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and spent the rest of the ride staring at the hills. The Vane Ranch was enormous and beautiful and completely without warmth. The main house would have 2 stories of pale limestone with deep-set windows that looked out at the valley like narrow, suspicious eyes. The bunkhouse beyond it held 12 men, and Martha counted them that first afternoon the way a person counts exits in an unfamiliar room automatically without thinking about why. The valley below the property was extraordinary, all red rock and scrub cedar running down to a wide flat basin where she was told 3 creek systems converged. It was the richest grazing land in the county. Silas owned the ridge. He did not yet own the basin. She understood within 48 hours that this was the central fact around which Silas Vane's entire existence rotated. He spoke of the valley the way other men spoke of destiny, with absolute conviction and the barely contained fury of a man who believes what is his is being withheld from him. The homesteaders down in the basin had been there for years. Some had been there longer than Silas had owned the ridge. He did not speak of them as people. He spoke of them as obstacles. On her 3rd night at the ranch, Silas told her he had business at the way station south of the valley and that she would ride along. He did not explain why. Martha had learned quickly that Silas rarely explained anything. He simply issued the shape of an event and expected the people around him to fill in whatever details they needed without troubling him. She put on her coat and climbed into the second wagon and said nothing. The way station was a low building, half stone and half timber, sitting at a crossroads where 2 cattle trails met. It belonged to a family named Brennan, a homesteader, and his wife and their young son, who ran the station as a stopping point for drovers moving cattle north. Martha had seen them once in town. The Brennans, the wife a small red-haired woman with steady eyes, and the husband a lean, sunburned man who laughed too loudly and meant every word of it. She had thought at the time that they seemed like people who had figured something out that most people hadn't. Silas told Martha to wait by the wagon while he went inside to talk business with Brennan. She stood in the dark listening to the horses breathe, watching the light in the way station windows. The night was clear and enormous, the kind of Texas sky that makes a person feel both very small and strangely free. All those stars flung out like they cost nothing. She had stood there for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard Brennan's voice rise sharply inside the building. Then Silas's voice, still low, still pleasant. Then silence. Then a sound that Martha had never heard before, but recognized instantly, the way the body recognizes certain things before the mind catches up. She moved without deciding to move. There was a root cellar entrance on the near side of the building, a slanted wooden door she had noticed when they arrived, and she crossed to it and pulled it open and dropped inside and pulled it shut above her almost in a single motion. The cellar was shallow and smelled of onions and dry earth. There were gaps between the floorboards above her, thin lines of lamplight falling through the dark, and she pressed herself into the corner beneath them and breathed through her mouth and did not make a sound. What she heard in the next 10 minutes changed the shape of her life irrevocably. Silas was not angry. That was the worst part. She had expected rage, because rage was something she knew how to categorize, something human and recognizable. Instead, his voice remained that same cool, almost conversational register as he told Cord and 2 other men to be thorough. There was movement above her. There was more sound that she would not let herself name. She pressed her back against the stone wall and stared at the gap between the floorboards and breathed in, out, in, out. She almost missed it. The Brennan woman had fallen near the edge of the room, near enough to the floor gap that when Martha finally made herself look up, she could see the woman's face in a thin slice of lamplight. Her red hair was loose, her eyes were open, and her hand was moving. Martha understood before she fully understood. She pressed her palm flat against the bottom of the floorboard nearest the woman's hand and felt the thin rectangle of parchment being pushed through the gap, and she closed her fingers around it and held on. The woman's hand went still. Martha did not breathe for a very long time after that. She heard boots moving above her. She heard Silas's voice once more, giving instructions she could not quite make out. She heard the wagons being brought around. And then gradually, the sounds moved away, and there was only the night, and the smell of onions, and the parchment folded inside her fist, damp with blood that was not her own. She waited until she could hear nothing at all before she unfolded it. The lamplight through the floorboards was barely enough, but it was enough. She could make out the official seal at the top, could make out the carefully surveyed lines of the valley basin, could make out the words that someone had underlined twice. In heavy ink, underground water rights, Harrow Valley Basin held in perpetuity. The Brennan family's deed, the water that fed every acre of the valley floor, the water that Silas Vane had been trying to acquire by every legal and extra-legal means available to him for 2 years, the single thing that stood between a dozen homesteader families and being driven off their land entirely. Martha Connolly, unwanted bride, held it in her shaking hands and understood exactly what it meant that she was holding it. She heard a man's voice outside, closer than she expected. Cord, telling someone to check the cellar. She moved. The back wall of the cellar had a drainage gap near the ground, barely wide enough, and she was not a small woman, but fear is a remarkable negotiator with the body, and she was through it, and flat against the back of the building before Cord's hand found the cellar door handle. She heard it creak open behind her. She was already running the parchment pressed flat against her ribs beneath her coat, running into the dark in the direction of exactly nothing. The desert did not care about her. That was almost a comfort. It made no promises and offered no mercy, and treated her exactly the same as it treated everything else that wandered into it without water or direction. Martha ran until she couldn't, and walked until she couldn't, and then ran again, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the parchment stayed dry against her skin, and she did not stop. She told herself she was not going to die out here. She told herself this with the same flat, exhausted conviction with which she had told herself so many things over the years. She was reliable. She was capable. She had 2 good hands and a stubborn streak that had outlasted every person who had ever told her she was too much or not enough. She had survived Philadelphia. She had survived the stagecoach and the dust and Silas Vane's cold eyes measuring her worth and finding it insufficient. She was not going to be stopped by a desert. She was, however, stopped by her own body sometime before dawn on a stretch of pale caliche flat where the ground offered nothing in any direction. She went down to her knees first, then to her hands, and then she simply lay down in the dust with the parchment still safe beneath her coat, and the sky still enormous and indifferent overhead, and she closed her eyes and thought with remarkable calm that this was not how she had expected things to go. She was still alive when the sound of a horse reached her. She registered it from very far away, a slow, deliberate sound, not in any hurry. Then the creak of leather, then a long silence, then a voice low and rough as gravel with no warmth in it whatsoever. You alive or not? It was not a question in any conventional sense. It was more like an assessment being made aloud. Martha opened her eyes. The sky above her had gone the deep gray blue of very early morning. She turned her head and saw the man looking down at her from the back of a sorrel horse, and the first thing she registered was the size of him, and the second thing was the scars, and the third thing, the thing that cut through the exhaustion and the fear and the dry, desperate ache of her thirst, was that he was alone. Barely, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he swung down from the horse, and he was even larger on the ground, and he said nothing else as he pulled a canteen from the saddle and crouched beside her. She drank without being told to. The water tasted like tin and salvation. She did not know yet that he had a name. She did not know yet that he was watching the dust trail she had left across the caliche flat with the calculating eye of a man already deciding how to use what he'd found. She did not know about the years of hunting or the burned-out land or the particular patient hatred he carried like a stone in his chest. She knew only that the water was real and that she was still alive, and that the parchment against her ribs had not yet been taken from her. She intended to keep it that way. His name was Elias Cade, and he told her this the way a man tells a stranger the weather flat and without invitation, while he built a small fire in the shelter of a limestone overhang and heated water in a battered tin pot. He did not ask her name in return. He did not ask her anything at all for the first hour, which Martha found she was grateful for, because she was not yet certain she could speak without her voice breaking apart, and she had no intention of letting that happen in front of a man she did not know. She sat with her back against the rock and watched him work and took his measure the way she had learned to take the measure of all difficult things carefully and without letting him see her doing it. He was somewhere past 50, she guessed, though it was hard to be certain because men who lived hard outdoors were their years differently than men who lived soft indoors. The scars on his face ran in two directions, one across the left cheekbone from something bladed, one down the right side of his neck, disappearing into his collar from something that had burned him, and they had long since finished being wounds and were simply part of the landscape of him, now the way a canyon wall carries the record of every flood that ever ran through it. His hands were enormous and scarred at the knuckles and entirely steady. The Winchester rifle leaned against the rock beside him with the ease of something that belonged there. He poured water into a cup and held it out to her without looking up. She took it. "You came out of the South," he said. It was not quite an accusation. "Yes." "On foot?" "My options were limited." He looked at her then directly, and his eyes were a dark, unreadable gray, the color of sky before serious weather. He held the look for just a moment and then went back to the fire. "The way station is south," he said, "the Brennan place." Martha's hand tightened around the cup. She said nothing. "I've been watching that road for 6 days," Elias said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire between them was small and disciplined, the kind of fire a man builds when he does not want to be seen. "I saw the wagons go in. I didn't see them come out with anyone extra." He paused. "Cord Reeves drives for Silas Vane. I know his style of horse." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Martha set the cup down on the rock beside her. She looked at the fire. She thought about what it meant that this man knew Silas's foreman by his horses, thought about the particular quality of attention required to watch a road for 6 days, thought about the Winchester, and the way he had found her before sunrise in the middle of a caliche flat without apparently looking for anyone at all. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Information." "About what?" "About whether they're still camped at the way station or moving." She studied his profile in the firelight. "Why?" "Because I've been trying to get Cord Reeves and 2 others into an open space for 14 months, he said, "and I haven't managed it yet." There was no particular emotion in his voice when he said this. That was what made it frightening. Martha had heard men speak in anger and men speak in grief, and men speak with the performative menace of someone who wants to be taken seriously. This was none of those things. This was a man stating a fact about his own life the way he might state that water ran downhill. It simply was. It had been true for 14 months. It would continue to be true until circumstances changed. She made a decision. She had always made decisions quickly when it mattered, even if no one had ever given her credit for it. "They were moving when I left," she said, "southeast, toward the valley road." Elias absorbed this without visible reaction. He poured himself water, drank it, set the cup down. "You took something from the station," he said. It was not a question. Martha did not answer. He did not press it. He banked the fire instead efficiently and without ceremony, and told her she could sleep for 2 hours and that he would wake her when it was time to move. He said this the way a man issues a field order without consulting anyone about whether the terms were acceptable. Martha lay down on the ground with her coat folded under her head and the parchment beneath her shirt against her skin, and was asleep in under 3 minutes, which was the most honest measure she had of exactly how exhausted she truly was. She did not sleep the full 2 hours. She woke after perhaps 90 minutes to the sound of Elias moving quietly at the edge of the overhang, standing very still, with his hand resting on the Winchester looking south. The sky had gone from black to the deep bruised purple of pre-dawn. She lay still and watched him, and thought about the fact that he had not taken anything from her while she slept, and wondered whether that was decency or strategy, and could not yet determine which. He turned and saw she was awake. "Riders," he said. 3, maybe 4, still far. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. They moved northeast through the broken country. For the rest of that morning, Elias on the sorrel and Martha behind him, her hands resting lightly on the back of the saddle, and her jaw set against the indignity of the position and every aching muscle in her body. He moved through the landscape like he had memorized it, which she gradually understood he had, choosing routes between rock formations that would leave no visible trail on the hard ground, crossing 2 dry creek beds at their narrowest points. He did not explain any of it. He simply moved and expected her to follow, and she followed because her other options remained limited. He gave her food around midday, dried beef and hard cornbread from his saddlebag, and they ate without stopping, and he gave her the canteen again, and she drank from it and handed it back, and that was the closest thing to conversation they had for 4 hours. She found herself thinking about the Brennan woman's hand, the way it had been so deliberate, so intentional right up to the last. She pressed the thought down and kept her eyes on the horizon and rode. It was late afternoon when he finally spoke again. "There's a place," he said. "Canyon country, another half-day north. Used to be a ranch. Abandoned." He paused. "It's defensible." Martha thought about the word defensible, thought about what it implied about the next several days. "Is that where you're taking me?" she said. "Yes. And what happens when we get there?" He was quiet for a moment. The country around them was opening up into wider flats, now the red rock formations standing like sentinels on either side. "We wait," he said. She could feel in the flatness of that answer that he was not telling her the whole of it. She had spent enough years reading the things men chose not to say to recognize the shape of an omission. But she was on a horse with nowhere else to go, and her body was running on borrowed reserves, and the parchment was safe, and she was alive, and she told herself that those facts were enough for now. He had her sleep again that evening, while he kept watch this time for longer. And when he woke her, the stars were different, and the air had gone genuinely cold. She ate more of the dried beef and drank water and watched him saddle the horse in the dark with the economy of motion that characterized everything he did, and she thought about what it meant that a man this practiced at surviving alone had lived this way long enough to make it look easy. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, looking for Vane's men. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Looking for Vane himself," he said, correcting her without sharpness. "His men are just the road to him." He checked the cinch on the saddle. 3 years more or less. That's a long time to hate someone. "It's not hate," he said. And then, after a pause that stretched long enough that she thought he had finished, "It's a debt." She did not ask what kind. Some debts don't need explaining. She had a few of her own. They rode through the night and into the next morning, and the country changed around them as the sun came up the flat scrubland, giving way to the deeper red rock of canyon country, the formations growing taller and more complex, the trails narrowing to single-file paths between stone walls that blocked the wind and swallowed sound. Martha had never been in country like this, and found that it moved something in her that she did not have a name for, something between awe and the particular comfort of feeling small against something genuinely large. The ranch appeared around a bend in the canyon without warning. It sat in a wide, natural bowl at the base of 3 converging rock walls, an old stone house with a partially collapsed roof and a barn that had lost one wall entirely, but kept the other 3 with stubborn persistence. There was a windmill improbably intact turning slowly in the draft that moved through the canyon. There was a stone wall running the perimeter that had once been a proper fence and was now a series of connected but gapped segments that nonetheless created a clear boundary between the inhabited space and everything beyond it. It had the look of a place that had once been someone's best effort and had simply been left behind when the effort ran out. Elias swung down from the horse and stood looking at the house for a moment with an expression that was complicated and controlled and gone before Martha could fully read it. He took the horse's reins and led it toward the barn without explaining anything, and Martha walked beside him and looked at the stone walls and the windmill and the collapsed section of roof and thought that she had slept in worse places, though not many. Inside the barn, while Elias tended to the horse with a careful attention that told her something about what he valued, Martha began taking inventory of the space the way she always had, automatically, practically, the way a woman who has managed difficult situations calculates resources before anything else. There was old hay in the loft dry and still usable for bedding. There were rusted tools hanging on the remaining wall. There was a water trough that the windmill fed, and she tested the mechanism and found it still functional, which was the best news she had received in 3 days. She was pulling dried mud from the trough mechanism when Elias said from behind her, "You don't have to do that." "I'm aware," Martha said without turning around. He was quiet for a moment. "The pump handle needs to be primed first." "I know how a pump works." Another pause. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was different from the flat operational tone he had maintained since he found her. Not warm exactly, but less like a wall. "There's a cellar under the house," he said. "Dry goods. Maybe some of them are still good." She turned then and looked at him. He was watching her with that gray-eyed steadiness, and she looked back at him with the same, and there was a moment of something that was simply 2 people recognizing each other as real, as present, as complicated. Before he turned back to the horse and she turned back to the pump. What she did not know, what she could not have known standing in that barn with mud on her hands and the windmill turning overhead, was that Elias Cade had chosen this place with calculation as precise as any military positioning. He had been leaving a trail since the moment he found her. Not obvious, not careless, but deliberate. Broken brush at the right intervals. A heel print on the one soft shoulder of the second creek crossing. Small readable signs for a man who knew how to read them, signs that pointed northeast into the canyon toward the abandoned ranch that sat at the base of 3 stone walls with one way in and the kind of natural ambush points that a man who had grown up in this country would understand immediately. He had been hunting Silas Vane for 3 years, and now finally he had something Silas would come for. He watched Martha prime the pump with capable, unsentimental hands and thought about what she was carrying under her coat, because he had seen the way she held her arm against her ribs in a particular protective way, and he was a man who noticed things. He did not yet know exactly what it was. He knew it was what Silas had sent men out into the dark to chase. He knew it was worth enough to her that she had crossed a desert on foot to keep it. And he knew that Silas Vane, who had never in his life left a loose end alone, would follow it here. He had not asked her. He would not ask her. What she was carrying was her business until the moment it became the mechanism of the trap, and then it would be the bait, and she would be the bait with it, and he would be in position on the canyon rim with the Winchester, and 3 years of patient grinding waiting would finally come to its end. He told himself this was the only logical course. He told himself she was alive, which was more than she would have been without him. He told himself that in the brutal arithmetic of a blood debt, one unwilling woman's comfort was not a weight that moved the scales. He told himself these things with the same flat conviction he told himself most things, and he almost believed them the way he almost believed a lot of things these days, which was not quite the same as believing them at all. Martha got the pump working. Clean water ran into the trough in a thin, steady stream, and she stood back and looked at it with something on her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood the expression of a person who has fixed a broken thing and feels briefly like the world is manageable. Elias watched her from the barn doorway. The canyon walls above them caught the last of the afternoon light and held it red and gold and utterly indifferent, the way the desert held everything without judgment or mercy or any particular interest in what happened next. The cellar under the house yielded 4 tins of salt pork, a sealed crock of dried beans, a sack of cornmeal that had gone partly to weevils but was mostly salvageable, and 2 bottles of rye whiskey wrapped in burlap that had kept better than anything else down there. Martha carried it all up into the ruined kitchen and assessed it the way she assessed most things, without sentiment and without complaint, and began to work. The kitchen had 3 walls and a partial 4th where the roof had come down and taken the corner with it, but the iron stove was intact and the flue still drew when she tested it with a twist of dry grass, which was what mattered. She found a cast iron pot hanging on a nail and scrubbed it with sand, and rinsed it with water from the pump, and put the beans on to soak. She used the good portion of the cornmeal and a measure of the salt pork fat, and made a pan of cornbread that was not pretty, but was solid and real, and filled the broken kitchen with a smell that did something complicated to the air of the abandoned place. Elias appeared in the doorway while she was stirring the beans, and stood there for a moment without speaking. She could feel him looking at the stove, the pot, the pan of bread cooling on the stone counter, and she did not turn around. "You didn't have to," he said, the same thing he had said at the pump. "We have to eat," she said, the same logic she had applied at the pump. He came inside and sat on the edge of what had once been a proper table and was now 3/4 of one, and she served the beans into 2 tin cups she had found in the cellar and handed him one, and they ate in the particular silence of people who are very tired and very hungry and have not yet determined what they are to each other. The beans were plain. The cornbread was dense. It was the best meal Elias Cade had eaten in longer than he could accurately remember, and something about that fact sat in his chest with an unfamiliar weight. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of them designed, and neither of them acknowledged the way rhythms tend to establish themselves between people who share a confined space and a common danger. Elias worked the perimeter in the mornings, checking and resetting the network of trip lines and warning devices he had rigged along the canyon. Approach lengths of fishing cord strung at ankle height between rocks, tin cans weighted with pebbles, placed at intervals a series of carefully balanced arrangements in the brush that would move wrong if something large came through. Martha watched him do this on the second morning from the doorway of the house, and said nothing and filed the information away in the careful, organized space where she kept things she was not yet ready to think about directly. She mended what could be mended in the house. She found old canvas in the barn and used it and some rusted nails to cover the broken corner of the kitchen, which was not beautiful, but kept the wind off the stove. She patched the worst gaps in the bedroom wall with a mixture of mud and dry grass that would not survive a serious rain, but would do for now. She swept the floors with a branch of cedar brush and found under the accumulated dust of what looked like a decade that the stone floors were fine work, carefully fitted, the kind of thing a man does when he is building something he intends to last. She found the old photographs on the 3rd day tucked into a gap in the bedroom wall behind a piece of loose stone. 3 of them small and faded, the silvered kind that captured light with an almost painful accuracy. A woman plainly dressed with a direct and pleasant expression. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10, standing very straight in what were clearly their best clothes, both of them squinting slightly against the sun. She held the photographs for a long time and then set them carefully on the windowsill where the light hit them in the late afternoon and went back to her work. Elias saw them that evening when he came in from the perimeter. He stopped. He stood in the bedroom doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the photographs in the window light for long enough that Martha, coming up behind him with a cup of water, stopped too and simply waited. "Your family," she said, not a question. "My mother," he said, "and the boys are me and my brother." His voice was completely level. "I haven't seen those in 15 years. Martha looked at the photographs again, at the two boys squinting into the sun. She thought about what it meant that he was here, in this abandoned place that had clearly once been his home, that the photographs were in the wall and not taken with him when he left. What happened to it, she asked, the ranch? He was quiet for a moment. "I was framed for cattle theft," he said, "by a man with enough money to make the charge stick. Lost everything in the legal proceedings. By the time I got clear of it, the property had been absorbed into a larger holding, and I had nothing left to come back for." He paused. "Except information." She thought about the trail they had left getting here, the broken brush and the creek crossing. She thought about the tin cans in the brush and the cord at ankle height. She thought about the word defensible and the word wait and the careful way he had not answered her question about what would happen when they arrived. All of it rearranged itself in her mind with the quiet, inexorable logic of a combination lock turning to its final number. She stood in the doorway and looked at his back and felt the shape of it settle over her with a cold clarity that was somehow almost peaceful. She found the easternmost trip line the next morning. She had told Elias she was going to look for firewood along the near canyon wall, and she did look for firewood, and she also walked the perimeter with careful attention, following the logic of a man who had built his defenses with the precision of someone who knew this land from childhood. She found 4 of the 7 warning arrangements before she made herself stop, because finding all 7 was not what this was about. She already understood enough. She came back to the house with an armload of cedar and put it down beside the stove and went inside and washed her hands at the basin and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the canyon walls for a while. Then she went to the bedroom and picked up the blood-stained parchment from where she kept it folded in the inside pocket of her coat, and she carried it to the 3/4 table in the kitchen, and she set it down in the center and smoothed it flat with both hands and sat down to wait. Elias came in from the barn an hour later. He stopped when he saw the deed on the table. He looked at it and then at her, and his gray eyes gave nothing away, which was itself a kind of answer. "Sit down," Martha said. He sat. She looked at him across the table. She had thought about what she wanted to say and had decided that she did not want to perform any particular emotion about it, not the anger she was entitled to, or the fear that lived underneath the anger, or the grief underneath that. She simply wanted to say the true thing and have it be said and move forward from there, because in her experience, the unspoken true thing was always more dangerous than the spoken one. "The trip lines face inward," she said, "toward the house, not outward toward the canyon approach." She paused. "A man setting traps to keep people out doesn't build them that way. A man setting a kill zone builds them that way. The warning arrangements in the brush are oriented to give you time to reach the rim position, not time to move me out." She looked at him steadily. "I'm the bait." Elias held her gaze. He did not confirm it or deny it. He sat with the same stillness he brought to everything and waited. "I've been bait before," Martha said. "Not literally, but the principle is the same." She pressed her palms flat on either side of the deed. "My whole life I've been something men use for their own purposes. My father used me for free labor and called it family obligation. The family that hired me used me for domestic work and called it charity. Silas Vane bought me for exactly what you see and called it marriage." She paused, not for effect, simply because the next part required a different quality of steadiness to say. "So if you need to use me as bait to kill a murderer, do it. At least this time, my life buys justice instead of slavery. She had expected him to defend himself, had expected the calculations she had seen in capable, pragmatic men when they are caught doing something indefensible but logically sound. The measured justification, the reasonable argument about the greater good and the available options. Elias Cade put his face in his hands. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was almost its opposite, a man simply putting his hands over his face the way a person does when they need a moment between one version of themselves and the next. His shoulders did not shake. He made no sound. He sat like that for perhaps 30 seconds, which was long enough for Martha to understand that she had said something that had gone somewhere inside him that she had not anticipated, somewhere deeper than the logical layer where she had aimed it. He put his hands down. He looked at her. Something in his face was different, and she could not name exactly what it was, except that it was less fortified than before, the way a wall looks different after the gate in it has been opened. "I set the trip lines facing inward on the second day," he said. "I told myself it was the most efficient configuration for the terrain." He stopped. "I've been telling myself things for 3 years. I've gotten good at it." Martha said nothing. She had said what needed saying. The rest was his. He stood up from the table and went outside, and she heard him on the perimeter for the next 2 hours, moving through the brush with a different sound than before, less methodical, more deliberate. When he came back in the evening, his hands were cut in 2 places from the fishing cord, and he went to the basin and washed them without comment. She found a scrap of clean cloth and brought it to him without comment. He wrapped his hands, and she watched him do it, and then she said, "There's beans left from this morning," and he said, "All right," and they ate together again at the 3/4 table with the deed still lying in the center of it, and neither of them moved it. She did not know when it changed exactly. That was the honest answer. It did not change in a single moment the way stories sometimes claimed love changed all at once in a flash of recognition. It changed the way the canyon light changed gradually, and then all at once by such small degrees that you could not identify the moment afternoon became evening, but you could look up at some point and know with certainty that the quality of the light was entirely different from what it had been. He started talking on the 4th evening. Small things at first, the name of the horse, a description of the country north of the canyon that he had learned to navigate blind in the years after he lost the ranch. The way the windmill had been broken when his mother died, and his brother had fixed it in a single afternoon, with nothing but a piece of wire and a particular kind of patience that Elias had always lacked, and had always secretly admired. He spoke about his brother with a careful neutrality that told her it was not neutrality at all. She talked, too, about Philadelphia, about the particular texture of a life lived in the margins of other people's households, always useful, never quite belonging, learning every room's rhythms and requirements, the way a person learns a foreign language fluently enough to function, never quite losing the accent that marks you as from somewhere else. She talked about the advertisement and the night she answered it and what she had told herself it meant. Elias listened with the complete attention of a man unaccustomed to having anyone speak to him directly, and finding it, to his evident surprise, something other than unwelcome. On the 5th morning she was clearing out the storm cellar at the back of the house, which she had been putting off because it was dark and low and smelled of old earth, and she had spent enough time in underground spaces recently. She found the usual detritus of an abandoned place. Rusted tools, a broken chair, a crock that had long since cracked and leaked its contents into the dirt floor. And at the very back of the cellar, on a stone shelf that had been built into the wall with the same careful workmanship as the kitchen floor, an old tin box with a hasp that had rusted shut. She brought it up into the daylight and set it on the stone wall and looked at it for a moment. It was not large. It was the kind of box a woman keeps letters in. She went and found Elias in the barn. He came and looked at it. without touching it for a long time. Then he worked the hasp open with his knife and lifted the lid. The letters were tied in bundles with ribbon that had once been blue and had faded to the color of old sky. The handwriting on the envelopes was a woman's neat and slanted. The name on the outermost envelope in each bundle was different. One bundle addressed to Elias. One addressed to a name that made his jaw tighten in a way she had not seen before. The name on the second bundle was Silas. She watched him unfold the first letter from his own bundle and read it, and she watched his face change as he read, and she did not ask, and she did not look away, because he had been alone with whatever this was for a very long time, and she did not think he needed solitude right now. He read 2 letters. Then he set them down on the stone wall with great care, and stood with his hands braced on the wall and his head bowed, and was very quiet. "He's my brother," Elias said, "my adopted brother. My mother took him in when he was 6. He paused. "I knew that. I knew we were raised together. I never knew." He stopped again. "She writes about it, in the letters, how he used to follow me everywhere, how he wanted everything I had, not because he wanted the things, because he wanted to be me and couldn't, and he never forgave either of us for it." Martha looked at the tin box, at the 2 bundles of letters, at the way the ribbon had faded on both of them equally, because they had been kept together tied with the same kind of care. "She kept writing to both of you," Martha said, "even after." "Even after," Elias said. The wind moved through the canyon, and the windmill turned, and the light on the red rock walls shifted by a degree so small it was almost imaginary. Martha reached out and put her hand over Elias's on the stone wall. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. He turned his hand under hers and held it not tightly. Simply held it the way a man holds on to something real when the ground under everything else has gone uncertain. They stayed like that for a while. The canyon held them the way it held everything, without judgment, without mercy, with the absolute and indifferent patience of stone. The first warning came at 3 a.m, a single tin can turning over somewhere in the brush at the canyon mouth, the sound small and precise in the enormous quiet of the desert night. Elias was already awake. Martha realized, coming fully alert in the darkness of the bedroom, with her heart already loud in her chest, that she was not certain he had slept at all. She heard him moving in the main room, the particular silence of a large man moving carefully, and then his shape filled the bedroom doorway. "They're here," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, which was its own kind of steadiness to hold on to. "How many?" she said. "Can't tell yet. More than 4. He paused. "Get dressed. Take the deed. Stay in this room until I come for you." She was already dressed. She had slept in her clothes for 3 days since the evening she brought him the tin box, and understood, without either of them saying it directly, that whatever was coming soon. She reached for her coat and put it on, and put the deed in the inside pocket and buttoned it closed. "All right," she said. He was gone before she finished the sentence. She went to the window and looked out at the canyon. The stars were extraordinary and indifferent, as they always were, and the canyon walls were black shapes against a slightly less black sky, and for a long moment she could see nothing that suggested anything was different from any other night. Then she saw movement at the canyon mouth, the kind of movement that resolves from shadow into human shape only when you know to look for it, and she counted 3, 4, 5 shapes fanning out across the approach, moving with the careful, practiced spacing of men who had done this before. The first shot came from the canyon rim. Elias had reached his position on the rim rock. The shot was not a warning and not an accident. It was precise and purposeful, and it sent the advancing shapes diving for cover behind the boulder field at the canyon mouth with an efficiency that told her he had hit something, though she could not tell what. The shapes reorganized in the darkness, and she heard voices too low to make out words. And then they began moving again differently now, splitting into two groups, one continuing up the center and one circling toward the base of the east wall. She understood then what she was watching. Silas had enough men to do this properly. He had sent one group to draw Elias's fire from the rim, while the flanking group came along the wall where the angle made rimrock shooting difficult. She had never studied military tactics in any formal sense, but she had always understood how pressure worked, how a superior force applied it from multiple directions simultaneously, because she had lived that principle in different forms her entire life. She left the bedroom window and went to the kitchen and looked at the stove. She had banked it before sleeping, and the coals were still live. She thought about what was available to her the way she always thought about available resources quickly and without wasting time on what wasn't there. The rye whiskey, the canvas she had used to patch the kitchen corner, the cedar she had stacked beside the stove. She started moving. The shooting from the rim was steady and disciplined, not rapid, the kind of fire a man lays down when he is managing his ammunition, because he knows he is one, and they are many. She heard return fire from below, louder and more ragged, the sound of men shooting at a position they couldn't clearly see. She heard something hit the stone exterior of the house and understood that at least some of them had her location identified and were moving toward it. She was dragging the cedar stack to the kitchen doorway when the barn door went. She heard it before she saw the light. The particular crack of dry old wood giving way under a concentrated impact. And then the orange glow began at the far end of the barn and moved fast because everything in the barn was old and dry and ready. The sorrel horse screamed once, and then she heard its hooves on the packed earth and the sound of it finding the gap in the barn wall she had noted when they arrived and disappearing into the darkness, and she said a small silent word of gratitude for that gap. The barn fire lit the canyon floor with a moving, dramatic light that changed everything. She could see them clearly, now 8 men, at least 2 already, at the near wall of the house, and she could see Elias's position on the rimrock silhouetted briefly against the fire glow and then gone again as he moved. The flanking group had reached the base of the east wall. They were cutting off his descent. The door of the house came open. Martha had the cast-iron skillet in her right hand and was standing to the left of the doorframe when Cord Reeves came through, which meant he did not see her immediately, and she swung the skillet with both hands and the full weight of her shoulders behind it, and connected with the side of his head with a sound that she would not think about later if she could help it. Cord went down in the doorway and did not get up. She stepped over him and pulled the door shut and dropped the wooden bar across it and stood with her back against it, breathing. 2 more at the window. She could see their shapes against the barn fire glow. She picked up the skillet again and moved to the side of the window and waited. And the first man came through head first, and she hit him across the shoulders, and he went down. And the second man came through on top of him, and they tangled together on the kitchen floor, and she moved backward toward the interior of the house, buying distance, measuring what she had. She had a cast-iron skillet, a live coal stove, 2 bottles of rye whiskey, and the deed to the Harrow Valley water rights pressed flat against her chest. The 2 men untangled themselves and got up, and the larger of them looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just been made to feel ridiculous by a woman and has decided to make that her problem, and he started toward her. She threw the first bottle of rye at the stove. It shattered against the iron, and the alcohol caught with a sound like a breath drawn sharply inward, and a sheet of blue flame ran across the stovetop, and the men stopped. The door came off its bar. Silas Vane walked into the burning kitchen like a man entering a room he already owned, which was exactly how he walked into every room. His black coat was dusty from the ride, but otherwise impeccable, which she noted with a distant, almost academic amazement. His eyes found her immediately, and held her with that cold, assessing look she remembered from the street in Harrow Creek a lifetime ago, measuring whether the furniture was going to fit. "Martha, ma'am," he said pleasantly, "you've been remarkably inconvenient." She said nothing. She was looking at the door behind him, And then Silas stepped to the side, and Elias was in the doorway, one of Silas's men behind him with a pistol at the base of his skull, and Martha's chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke beginning to thicken in the kitchen. Elias looked at her. His face was cut along the left temple, and his hands were at his sides, and he was very still, the stillness of a man who is measuring every variable in a room simultaneously and has not yet found the one that opens it. His eyes went to her coat to where the deed was, and then back to her face. Silas moved to the center of the kitchen with the ease of a man entirely confident in his position, which he had reason to be. The man with the pistol at Elias's head. 2 more men behind Silas. The stove fire between Martha and the door. She thought about the tin box in the cellar, and the 2 bundles of letters with their faded blue ribbons, and the way Elias had said he and Silas had been raised together, and she looked at Silas now and tried to find in his face any remnant of those 2 boys squinting into the sun in their best clothes. She could not find it. Whatever had been there had been burned out and replaced with something colder and more final a very long time ago. "The deed," Silas said. He held out his hand. The gesture had the automatic expectation of a man who has never held his hand out for anything and not had it filled. "In exchange for my brother's life. It's a fair trade, Martha, more than fair. You came here with nothing, and you leave with nothing, which is exactly what you deserve, but you leave alive, and so does he. That is considerably more than I offered the Brennans." He said the last sentence with the same pleasant tone he used for everything, and Martha understood that he meant it as a demonstration of generosity, and that he entirely believed it was won. She looked at Elias. He looked back at her, and something in his gray eyes said, "No," said, "Don't." Said the particular desperate thing that a man says without words when he understands what the person he loves is about to do and cannot stop it. She held his gaze for one more moment. She wanted to hold it longer. She thought she could have looked at that face scarred and steady and more honest than anyone she had met in 32 years of living for considerably longer than she was going to get. She reached into her coat and took out the deed. Silas's hand was still extended. His eyes were on the parchment with the focused intensity of a man seeing the culmination of years of obsession finally within reach, close enough to touch. And that focus was complete and total. And it was the only thing Martha had been waiting for. She wrapped the deed around the handle of the iron skillet. She looked up at the kerosene lamp hanging from the ceiling beam above and slightly behind Silas, the one she had noted when Cord first came through the door, the one that had been swinging slightly in the draft from the broken kitchen corner, swinging with the gentle pendulum regularity of something hung on a long chain. She threw the skillet with everything she had. The lamp came down. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was a small sound glass and tin, a brief percussion against the beam above Silas's head. And then the kerosene caught, and it was not a small sound anymore. It was a sound like a door opening into a larger room, a sudden roaring expansion of light and heat that drove the men nearest the stove backward and sent a wall of fire cascading down the beam and across the kitchen floor between Silas and the place where Elias stood in the doorway. The deed burned. The parchment caught before it hit the ground the surveyed lines and the official seal and the twice underlined words curling and blackening with a speed that suggested they had always been more fragile than anyone. Had believed that everything that made them valuable existed only in the agreement of people to believe in them. And now they were ash, and the Harrow Valley water rights were ash and $1 million of leverage and power, and Silas Vane's entire reason for being in this canyon was ash on a burning kitchen floor. Silas screamed. It was the first fully human sound she had ever heard him make. The man behind Elias flinched backward from the fire, and Elias moved, because Elias was always watching for the variable that opened the room, and now it had opened, and he drove his elbow into the man's throat and took the pistol from him before he finished falling, and was through the burning kitchen and had Martha's arm and was pulling her toward the doorway before Silas finished screaming. The canyon outside was chaos orange with the barn fire and loud with the sound of men who had lost their organizing principle trying to reestablish one. Elias moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the focused efficiency of a man who knows exactly where he is in a landscape he memorized before he was 10 years old. He pulled her along the east wall away from the men still at the canyon mouth toward a cleft in the rock she had not noticed in 6 days of looking at these walls because it was hidden behind a stand of cedar that looked like part of the canyon wall from any approach angle. She ran. She had run before in her life, and she ran now with everything she had, the smoke behind them and the fire lighting the canyon walls orange, and the night air hitting her face, cold and real. Elias was ahead of her, and his hand was around her wrist, and she could feel his pulse there, rapid and strong, and she concentrated on that as they pushed through the cedar and into the narrow cleft, and the sound of the canyon fell away behind them. They came out on a ledge 40 feet above the canyon floor, and Martha looked back. The house was burning fully now, the old stone walls holding but the interior entirely gone. The kitchen fire, and the kerosene, and the cedar she had stacked in the doorway, all of it merged into something enormous and final. She could see shapes moving below men, trying to organize around a man who had stopped organizing them. A man in a black coat standing at the edge of the firelight, staring at the burning house with an expression she could not read at this distance, but did not need to. Elias stood beside her on the ledge. His hand had moved from her wrist to her hand, and neither of them had made a decision about that. It had simply happened the way some things between people simply happen once enough, other things have fallen away. "The deed," he said. "Gone," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Below them the fire roared, and the canyon walls held the heat and the light in their stone faces the way they held everything, without preference, without judgment, with the absolute democracy of rock. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. She felt him exhale beside her, a long, slow breath that she thought carried more things in it than she could name. The 3 years of hunting and the tin box of letters and the 2 boys in their best clothes and the particular grief of a man who has just lost the last solid thing in his account of why his life has gone the way it has gone. And underneath all of that may be something that was not entirely grief. She could not be certain. She was not certain of very much in this moment except the fire below and the cold air on her face, and the hand holding hers in the dark. "We need to move," Elias said. His voice was steady. "Yes," Martha said. They moved. Below them, at the edge of the firelight, Silas Vane turned away from the burning house and looked up at the canyon walls, with eyes that had lost the pleasant calculated quality that had always characterized them and found something rawer and less governed in their place. He was shouting. She could hear it faintly, the words indistinct, and she thought she could make out Elias's name in it, and something that might have been the word brother, and the fire took most of it, and gave it back as smoke. The ledge path was narrow, and Martha moved along it with her hand on the stone wall and her eyes on the darkness ahead, and did not look back again. The ledge path brought them out above the canyon on the north side onto a wide shelf of rim rock where the stars were so close and so many that Martha stopped for a moment simply because her body needed to stop and because looking at those stars was the only thing available to her that was entirely without menace. Elias let her stop. He stood beside her with the pistol he had taken from Silas's man and looked back at the canyon below, and she could see in his profile the particular quality of a man listening to something she could not yet hear. Then she heard it too, from below, from inside the burning canyon, a sound that was not the fire and not the shouting of Silas's men organizing their retreat. A different sound. the massive percussive crack of old timber giving way under concentrated heat, followed by a human sound that was very brief, and then swallowed entirely by the roar of the fire. Elias went still. She watched his face in the firelight that rose from below, and she saw the moment the sound registered and was interpreted, saw it move through him like a wave, moves through deep water, changing the surface while the depth below remained unknown. His jaw tightened. His hand on the pistol did not move. He stood on the rimrock above the burning house of his childhood and listened to the silence that followed and did not speak for a long time. "The roof," he said finally. "Yes," Martha said. He lowered the pistol slowly. He looked at the canyon below, at the fire painting the stone walls in orange and gold, at the smoke rising in a column that the stars disappeared into. He looked for a long time. Martha stood beside him and did not fill the silence with anything because there was nothing useful to fill it with, and she had never been a woman who used words to avoid the true weight of a moment. "I lowered my gun," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Before we ran, I had the shot and I lowered my gun." "I know," she said. "I saw." "I didn't want to carry it," he said. "The fratricide. I didn't want to be the man who did that." He paused. "I don't know if that was right or if it was weak." Martha thought about this honestly, because he had asked it honestly, and he deserved the same in return. "I think those two things aren't always as different as men like to believe," she said. "And I think your mother would have known the difference, and I think she would have said, 'You were right.'" He looked at her. In the firelight, his scars were very visible, and his eyes were very dark, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had carried a hard thing for a very long time, and was now standing on the other side of it, and was not entirely sure yet what the landscape looked like from here. "She would have liked you," he said. Martha felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. "She sounds like a woman of good judgment," she said, and Elias made a sound that was almost a laugh, the first she had heard from him, brief and rough and entirely genuine. They found the sorrel horse the next morning. It had gone up the North Canyon Trail in the dark, the way a horse that has been in a place before will find its way back to familiar ground, and it was standing in a small grass flat above the rimrock, with its reins trailing and its ears forward, watching them approach with the calm expression of an animal that has decided the night's events were humanity's problem and not its own. Elias put his hand on the horse's neck and stood there for a moment with his forehead against the animal's jaw, and Martha looked away and gave him that. They rode north and then northwest, away from Harrow Creek and away from the valley, and away from the ash of everything that had burned. Martha rode behind Elias with her hands on his back and her cheek against his shoulder blade, and felt the steady movement of him breathing in and out alive and present and real, and she thought that this was enough. This specific thing right now was enough, and she let herself simply be inside it without reaching past it to the next problem, which was a thing she had almost never in her life allowed herself to do. The next problem arrived anyway, as next problems do, in the form of a county sheriff's deputy named Aldous Briggs, who intercepted them on the valley road 2 days later with a warrant in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he would rather be doing almost anything else. He was a narrow, honest-looking man in his 40s who had been a deputy in Harrow County for 11 years and had spent most of those 11 years watching Silas Vane operate just inside the boundary of what he could prove, and had developed about it an expression of permanent, exhausted resignation. He looked at Elias. He looked at Martha. He looked at the warrant in his hand. He looked back at Elias. "There's a fire investigation," he said, "involving the Cade Canyon property," he paused, "and reports of gunfire and the disappearance of several men who rode out with Silas Vane 3 nights ago and haven't come back yet. Cord Reeves is in the kitchen doorway of the house," Elias said, "or what's left of it. He came through the door at me, and I put him down." He paused. "The others left. You'll find them if you look between the canyon mouth and the valley road heading southeast. They didn't want any more of it once the fire got going." Deputy Briggs absorbed this. "And Silas Vane himself." "The roof came down," Elias said. "He was inside." Another pause. Something moved through Briggs's expression that was complicated and honest, and not entirely unlike the expression of a man who has been carrying a stone in his shoe for 11 years and has just been told he can take it out. "Were you present when that occurred?" he said carefully. "I was on the rim rock," Elias said. "My gun was lowered." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Martha, who looked back at him with the particular steady calm of a woman who has been through enough in the past 2 weeks to find a county deputy's scrutiny fairly manageable. Then he folded the warrant and put it back in his coat pocket. "I'm going to need statements about that," he said, "from both of you, in town, in writing." "All right," Elias said. "The Brennan property," Martha said. Both men looked at her. "The way station south of the valley. I need to tell you what happened there, what Silas did, and who was present." She held Briggs's gaze. "I was a witness. I was 6 inches away, underneath the floorboards. I can give you names." Briggs looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him recalibrating something, understanding that what he had ridden out here, expecting a straightforward arson investigation and a fugitive situation, had turned into something considerably larger and more significant. He straightened in his saddle. "All right," he said, and there was a different quality in his voice now, the resignation replaced by something more purposeful. "You'd better come with me then." The statements took 4 days. Martha gave hers first in the sheriff's office in Harrow Creek, in the same town where she had stepped off the stagecoach a lifetime ago into the white noon glare and seen Silas Vane on the porch of the feed store measuring her worth and finding it insufficient. She sat in a straight-back chair and told Deputy Briggs and 2 men from the county land office everything she had seen beneath the floorboards of the Brennan Way station in a clear and detailed and entirely steady voice, and she did not look away from any of it. The men wrote everything down. When she was finished, Briggs looked at his notes for a long moment, and then looked at her and said, "Ma'am, you understand what you've just described is going to overturn a significant number of land transactions in this county." "Yes," Martha said. "I'm aware of that." "The family's Vane displaced," he said carefully. "If the original deeds are found to be fraudulent, and with testimony like yours, they will be those families have legal recourse." "That's why I'm telling you," Martha said. The Brennan water deed was gone. She had known it was gone from the moment she watched the parchment curl and blacken in the kitchen fire, and she had made her peace with it in the way she made her peace with most irrevocable things, by acknowledging it directly and then deciding what came next. What came next, it turned out, was that the county land office sent 2 surveyors to the Brennan Way Station property and found buried in an oilskin packet in the same root cellar where Martha had hidden a copy of the original deed filing that James Brennan had registered with the county land office 7 years prior. Because James Brennan had been the kind of man who laughed too loudly and meant every word of it, and also kept meticulous records because the frontier had taught him early that a man's word lasted only as long as the man did. The water rights, it emerged, had never been solely Brennan's to lose. They were registered in the original filing as a community water trust held on behalf of 7 Valley homesteader families, of which the Brennans were the primary trustees. Silas Vane had spent 2 years and a quantity of violence trying to acquire a document that was in the end not a deed that could be transferred at all. Martha sat in the sheriff's office and listened to the land office men explain this and felt something move through her that was not quite laughter and not quite weeping, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She told Elias that evening, sitting on the steps of the boarding house where they had taken rooms on opposite sides of the hall, with the entirely unconvincing propriety of 2 people who have held hands on a rimrock above a burning canyon and are trying to remember how to navigate ordinary life. He sat beside her on the steps and listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "She died for a document that couldn't be sold," he said. "She died protecting something that couldn't be taken," Martha said. "That's different." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." The legal proceedings took the better part of a year. Elias gave his statements and answered the questions put to him about the night in the canyon with the same flat, honest precision he brought to everything, and the conclusion reached by the county inquest was that Silas Vane had died as a direct consequence of a fire that his own men had set at his own direction, which was as clean an accounting of karmic justice as the law was generally capable of producing. Elias was not charged with anything. Martha was not charged with anything. Cord Reeves recovered from the skillet and was charged with a considerable number of things and stopped being a problem. The Valley families got their land back. Not all of them, and not without difficulty, but enough, and the Water Trust was formally reestablished with 3 surviving Valley families as co-trustees, which was enough to keep the basin green through the dry summers, and that was what had always mattered. Elias filed a reclamation claim on the canyon property. It was a long process and an expensive one, and it required him to spend 6 months in the county courthouse reading documents that were not designed to be easily understood by anyone without a legal education, which he remedied by hiring a young lawyer from El Paso, who turned out to be the most useful person either of them had met in years. The claim was granted on a Tuesday morning in early spring, and Elias walked out of the courthouse into the sunshine and found Martha waiting on the step with 2 cups of coffee from the establishment across the street, and handed one to him without ceremony, and he took it, and they stood together in the warmth for a while without saying anything. They were married in the fall in a ceremony so small and plain that it barely qualified as a ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher in the parlor of the Harrow Creek boarding house with Deputy Briggs as witness, because he was the only person in the county who knew the full shape of their story and had decided on the basis of it that he approved of them. Martha wore her good dress, the blue one she had bought with her first money earned in Harrow Creek, doing accounts for the general store, a thing she had done because she was capable, and because keeping busy had always been her first and most reliable defense against the parts of life that required patience to get through. Elias wore a clean shirt and had made some effort with his hair that she found entirely endearing and did not mention. The preacher asked if they had anything to say to each other, and Martha had not prepared anything because she had not known he was going to ask, and she suspected Elias hadn't either. And they looked at each other for a moment, and Elias said, "I found you in the desert, and I intend to keep you," which was possibly the least romantic declaration in the history of the institution, but was so completely and authentically Elias Cade that Martha felt it move through her like clean water, and said, "That suits me." And the preacher pronounced them married, and Briggs shook both their hands with evident satisfaction, and that was that. They rebuilt the Canyon Ranch over the following 2 years, not quickly and not extravagantly, but steadily, the way things get built when the people building them intend to live inside what they make and are not performing the building for anyone else. The stone walls of the house were sound and needed only a new roof and the broken corner properly repaired, which Elias did with the same careful workmanship as the man who had originally laid the floors. Martha rebuilt the kitchen first because that was where she worked, and because a kitchen that functions well is the engine of everything else in a home. She put the window where the light hit it properly in the afternoon, and she put the stove where the draw was best, and she put a proper table in the center, 4-legged and level with 4 chairs around it, for the guests she intended to have. The windmill she left exactly as it was. The photographs of Elias's mother and the 2 boys she had cleaned and reframed and hung on the bedroom wall where the light from the east window reached them in the morning. Elias had not asked her to do this. He came into the bedroom the morning after she hung them and stood looking at them for a while, and then went to the basin and washed his face, and said nothing, which was how she knew it was exactly right. There was a garden by the 3rd year. Beans and cornmeal and dried beef had served their purpose. But she had always understood that a home reveals its true nature, in its surplus, in what it grows beyond survival. And so she put in a kitchen garden along the south wall where the stone held the heat and extended the growing season by a month on either end. Tomatoes, peppers, 2 kinds of squash, a row of sunflowers along the outer edge that served no practical purpose whatsoever and that she planted specifically for that reason. Elias built her a fence around the garden to keep the deer out, and built it with the same meticulous care he brought to everything structural, fitting the post level and stringing the wire tight. She brought him water while he worked, and he drank it and handed the cup back, and she stood watching him for a moment, this large, scarred, entirely real man working in the afternoon light, with the canyon walls red and gold around them, and the windmill turning in the canyon draft. And she thought about the stagecoach, and the advertisement, and the white noon glare of Harrow Creek, and the night under the floorboards, and the desert, and the fire, and all of the distance between that woman and this one. And she thought that the distance was not as great as a person might assume from the outside, because both women had been the same woman all along, simply in different circumstances, and the circumstances had finally, after 32 years and considerable difficulty, caught up to what she had always actually been. Elias drove the last fence post and turned and found her watching him and said, "What?" in the direct way he said most things. "Nothing," she said. He looked at her for a moment with his gray eyes that she had learned to read, the way you learn to read weather in canyon country by paying attention to small signs and trusting what they told you. "You're thinking something," he said. "I'm thinking we need more fence posts next season," she said. "The garden's going to be bigger." He looked at the garden, at the sunflowers she had put along the edge for no reason, and something moved in his expression that was the closest he came in ordinary moments to the kind of warmth that other men wore more openly. "All right," he said. She handed him the hammer, and he took it, and their hands touched briefly in the passing, and neither of them made anything of it. And both of them felt it the way people who have chosen each other feel even the smallest contacts, not with the desperate urgency of new love, but with the quiet, sustaining certainty of something that has been tested by fire and proven to be exactly what it claimed to be. The sun was going west behind the canyon rim, and the light it left on the red rock walls was extraordinary. The particular gold of a Texas late afternoon that exists only for a few minutes at this hour and then is gone, and it fell across the garden and the fence, and the two of them standing in it with the unhurried generosity of light that belongs to no one and cannot be bought or taken or burned. Martha Connolly, who had been too much and not enough her whole life, stood in the golden light of the canyon she had come to by accident and by disaster, and by a kind of stubborn, unglamorous courage that no one had ever written songs about. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she knew it, the way you know the things that are most true, not dramatically, and not all at once, but quietly, and all the way down.